Now we're told that the 24 elders sitting before God, they begin to worship, fall upon their faces. In other words, this is the church in heaven. It causes the church in heaven to worship and to celebrate the coming of Christ to the earth. This will be the answer of our prayer. Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And then the nations were angry. Now that reveals the fact that the stubborn rebellion of man will be right down to the very end, right down to the wire. The stubborn heart of man is in rebellion against God, and this old nature, this carnal nature that you and I have, it's not obedient to God. Friends, you couldn't even make this old nature that you and I have. You couldn't make it obedient to God. I don't care what you do. And this is exactly what Paul says. He says, because the carnal mind is enmity against God, it's not subject to the law of God, neither indeed can be. You just couldn't bring this old nature under. That's the reason he's going to get rid of it someday. And that someday is coming. It says here the nations were angry. Because why? The wrath of God has come. They've been fed all this putrid pablum today about the fact that God never intends to punish sin and that man's getting better and better every day, while all the time he's getting worse and worse. Now, the sixth thing I note here, and the time of the dead to be judged. Now, that brings us to the great white throne judgment we're going to see in the 20th chapter. And then we read, and to give the reward to your servants the prophets, and to the saints, and to them that fear thy name, the small and the great. Now, the church has already gone into his presence. The believers there have already been rewarded. We saw the crowns on the heads of the elders. Now, these are Old Testament saints, tribulation saints, that are included in the first resurrection, but at a different time, and they are now going to be rewarded as the kingdom begins. And also, he's going to destroy those who destroy the earth, and that's both man and Satan, for man is a destroyer as well as Satan is. And we're warned today, be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Now that brings us down to verse 19, and I shall read it. And we read here, and the sanctuary, or the temple of God in heaven, was open. Now when we see the church again, it'll be in the New Jerusalem. And we're told definitely there's no temple there. So here, there is a temple in heaven. And that temple that Moses made was made after the pattern in heaven. But the church goes to the New Jerusalem. That'll be our eternal abode. That's our heaven. And it's going to be heaven, friends, in spite of the fact that you and I are going to be there. Now, I read, in the sanctuary of God, or the temple of God in heaven, was opened. And that means that God is dealing now with Israel. And the ark of his covenant was seen in his sanctuary, in his temple. And there followed lightnings and voices and thunders and an earthquake and great hail. Now, that confirms again that there's a literal temple in heaven. That's important. Now, this sanctuary, a temple of God in heaven, not only does that, but it was opened. And that indicates worship and access to God. All of this points to the nation Israel. The church has no temple. The measuring of the temple on earth and the opening of the temple in heaven declares the prominence of Israel in this section. And the next chapter will substantiate this. Now, the ark of his covenant was seen in his sanctuary. It reminds us that we're dealing with a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. And he's going to keep the covenants he's made with Israel, and he'll make a new covenant with them at this time. That is, the law will be written in their hearts instead of cold tablets of stone. Now, I come down where it says lightnings and voices and thunders and an earthquake and great hail that speak of judgment that's yet to come. And this opens up for us now, actually, chapter 12. We move now to chapter 12. And those of you that have our books, you will have to pick up volume 2 now if you want to follow our study along in the book. But if you have your Bible, why, just follow along here as we come to chapter 12. And here you have the final conflict between Israel and Satan after he's cast out of heaven. And 7 performers are introduced to us by this 7th trumpet that is blown during the Great Tribulation period. And we find here the woman is the first, the red dragon second, the child of the woman, and then we have Michael the archangel, and then the dragon persecutes the woman, and then we have the remnant of Israel here. We have 6 that are introduced to us. And then the next chapter, 13, we'll see the 2 beasts that are presented to us. These are the 7 that we have. Although the 7th trumpet of chapter 11 brings us through the Great Tribulation and the millennium to the very threshold of eternity, you see a great deal of detail was omitted. So beginning with chapter 12, this will be compensated for in the presentation of 7 prominent personages who play a dominant part in the Great Tribulation period. You have here, after that, the pouring out of the 7 bowls of wrath, and then the final destruction of commercial Babylon and religious Babylon. Now, the prominence of the nation Israel is brought before us. It was suggested in the previous chapter with the measuring of the temple on earth and the opening of the temple in heaven. And the last verse that we read of chapter 11 is the opening to this chapter here. Now, these 7 personages are representatives of persons, both natural and supernatural, physical and spiritual, rulers and nations. And the identification and clarification of these is essential for a proper understanding of the revelation. And let me then take up the very first one, and that will illustrate what we're talking about. And we've come now, actually, to the crux of the interpretation of the entire book of Revelation, and it revolves about this point. I heard an outstanding minister, very intellectual minister, years ago, make the statement that if you tell me your interpretation of the woman in the 12th chapter of Revelation, and I'll tell you your interpretation of prophecy. And I thought, my, how foolish that man was. Well, let me today make the statement. You tell me what your interpretation of this woman is, and I'll tell you your interpretation of prophecy. I believe that this is the key.